Next, we'd like to welcome Dr. SELWYN Carrington.
Morning. Thank you very much. Panel, Mrs. Erica Williams-Connell, Mr. Padmore, Mrs. Dupre, ladies and gentlemen. I see one of my former colleagues sitting at the bench, surprised that he sees me here. Ladies and gentlemen, I wrote a formal lecture, which I would not give as a lecture, called Capitalism and Slavery, 50 Years of Achievement. In today's world, achievement is viewed in a short-term manner, short-term accomplishments. And these were aimed and are aimed mainly at satisfying immediate political goals. However, when we think of capitalism and slavery, we have to think of achievement in the long term. Eric Eustace Williams is the best example of an achiever in the long-term goal. His work exemplifies scholarship. I'm certain at the time that Williams was researching and writing his seminal work in London, his supervisor, because those of you who know about supervising will know that your supervisor warns you from time to time whether the work is up to standard. I'm certain that he would have been warned, cautioned about that interpretation, and that he would have been told that if he persisted in that viewpoint, he may not get his doctorate at all. But William continued because it was his viewpoint, his interpretation, that he must overturn the traditional conservative school of thought to which his supervisor belonged. How could this young colonial radical, attending one of England's premier institutions, reinterpret history to show that the colonies worked by slaves were responsible for the economic development of Britain and provided the capital for the Industrial Revolution? But not satisfied with this, that same brash young man went on to claim that it was the economic downturn in the West Indies that accounted for the abolition of the slave trade, and then slavery, and then the passage of the Sugar Duties Act. Didn't he hear about British philanthropy? Didn't he hear about British fair play? Didn't he hear about British religious fervor, British humanitarianism, British reform movements? Had no one told him of the unceasing efforts of those British humanitarians to free the slaves in the West Indies? Or had this man, of course, coming from the colonies with such little gray matter, only think of the economic reasons, which he might have read in one book at the time, and was linked to what one historian had said? Anyway, this was expected. The poor chap may have been fetting and did not have time to read adequately. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the English mind may have perceived the inability of Eric Eustace Williams to produce a book of that quality. But it is about 58 years ago that Williams worked in the archives of London, and God knows where else, to produce a DPhil thesis entitled The Economic Aspect of the Abolition of the West Indian Slave Trade and Slavery. It is in that work that Williams was first to air his views and to test the waters with regards to the theses that inhabit that famous book, Capitalism and Slavery. I once heard a criticism at a conference that he was more objective with regards to the abolition thesis in the thesis. Well, one understands that because those of you who have worked for PhDs know that you can't come out with all your armor since you have to get the thing accepted. Thus, the DPhil, being an important weapon in his armory, he was certain that he would have it accepted before he put his real stuff down. Hence, since the DPhil was important, Williams was not as full-fledged in his criticism as in Capitalism and Slavery. You have to read the comment which is written in the copy in the Rhodes House Library to understand the point I'm trying to make. Anyway, all of this is history. While as a professor at Howard, he wrote or completed and finished, he completed and published Capitalism and Slavery. This is a great book. I have read it several times, and I'm not going to profess to understand it. It is a great book. It is original, and it's the reason why the publishers have reissued it with an introduction by an equally great scholar and Caribbean man, Dr. Palmer. The Republication speaks thousands of words. And like the Sphinx in the Greek mythology, it rises from the ashes to assume its rightful place among the scholarly works of the period. The burning question is, why has this work remained as relevant today as it was 50 years ago? Ladies and gentlemen, that study has all the theses that you want about capitalism, its relationship with slavery, its relationships to society. It talks about dependency. It talks about debt crises. It talks about everything. As the scholars before me said, it talks about abolition from below. I have attempted to meet my own prescriptions with regards to reading the material before you criticize that book. Some historians do not do that. One of his first theses is a thesis on the economic origins of slavery. Every white scholar in the world accepts it because it absolves them from any criticism that they had introduced slavery because it was racial. After all, Europeans went down to a continent full of black, docile people whose numbers seemed unending. That's the elasticity theory that economists and historians tend to apply. And then, of course, they took them there, no harm to them, shipped them out to the islands to produce sugar, cotton, or to mine gold and silver. Today's scholars want us to believe that Africans had not played a major role in the entire event of slavery, and that sugar was not known to Africans before they began it in the Spanish West Indies, in Hispaniola, and then in Barbados. However, white historians are certain that their goal is to allow white supremacy to survive, and hence works which show the formalization, the economic formalization of black slavery are going to be adopted. So they don't test that thesis. They accept that one. The other two worry them. The first that I'm going to deal with is one called the reasons for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. Dr. Palmer told you that thesis, so I will just recount for you how white scholars go about trying to attack it in 2 minutes. Some of the notable scholars, such as William Darity Jr. from North Carolina, David Mackinson, Richard Sheridan, Barbara Sulu, have adopted it. So have 2 other scholars, tentatively, Richard B. Anstey and David Breon Davis. David Breon Davis, in a work called Reflections on Abolitionism and Ideological Hegemony, wrote that the opposition to slavery cannot be divorced from the vast economic changes that were taking place at the time. To him, these were the reason for the abolition of the slave trade. However, he went on to quote, "The West Indian decline appeared all the more dramatic. Sugar and slaves were not a source of opulence, but of wasted soil, decayed properties, and social depravity. Therefore, it was surprising that after Seymour Drescher published Econicide, that Davis, who had done no other research at all, turned around and denied that one, slavery was profitable, or that the decline of the West Indies led to the abolition of slave trade and slavery. But little did Davis know that as early as 1869, and I'm certain he was not a colored or black Jamaican, I'm certain he was a white Jamaican, called Hall Pringle, published a book called Of the Fall of the Jamaica Sugar Planters. And in that book, he stated, or he criticized critics who stressed, quote, he called the critics of the theory of the decline of the West Indies careless of the dishonor thus sought to be brought on the country, who are bold enough to assert that though England was the first to suppress Negro slavery, the nation has now discovered its mistake. That's exactly the historical perspective. I got a little wrong because I'm trying to eat it up. That is exactly the historical perspective that people like David Bryan Davis, Breon Davis, David Eltis, David Richardson, and a number of the white scholars tried to say. England abolished slavery, and when she realized the profits to be made, she regretted it. Well, in fact, Hall Pringle called them apologists of slavery. In fact, what we find is that these white scholars are recycling history and passing it off as new, which we know are not innovative. You're really upsetting. The profitability of slavery, which is the other major thesis in Williams, I wouldn't say much about that because I don't have any time. I will just read the conclusion I wrote to this thing. Ladies and gentlemen, capitalism and slavery has contributed to a vast quantity of literature since the 1960s. Writers will continue to assess and evaluate Dr. Williams's less developed theses scattered throughout the book, his ideas on dependency theory, revolution and change, Haiti, exploitation, credit and debt crises, social change, and so forth. The republication of capitalism and slavery has certainly maintained its image as a historical things. The book will continue to be a beacon to black scholars, I hope, who must single out and uphold the contribution which Africans and their descendants have made to civilizations. It must remain a critical part of the historiographical literature and a bulwark against the charges that we have made no contribution to Western society. Capitalism and slavery has made an indelible contribution to scholarship, and I'm certain, as Dr. Palmer said, 50 years from now, historians will republish it. And within those 50 years from now, they will continue to quarrel as to whether or not it is accurate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Carrington.